Today we're moving into middle childhood, so this would be age range of about 7 to 12. One of the things I'll just kind of call your attention to, I think your textbook calls this same period late childhood. So anytime you see late childhood or middle childhood, just know for this class they're interchangeable. I don't know why there's different terminology across different textbooks, but that's just how it is. But again, the age range we're going to talk about here is 7 to 12. And as usual, we're going to start with physical and cognitive development, and then we'll talk about some of the social and emotional developments that take place during this age range. So probably one of the most pronounced things that's happening physically during this kind of like pre-teen age are that you start to see some real pronounced gender differences in growth and motor ability. So up to this time, up to 7, if you were to look at a little boy and a little girl, if they didn't have a lot of the social cues that we tend to associate with gender, you might have difficulty telling what their gender is. So, if you've got a boy with long hair, then you might mistake them for a girl pretty easily up until this point. So again, around 7 to 12 is when we start to see a lot of those gender differences. So that's the main thing we'll focus on as far as physical development. Then getting into cognitive development, we see some kind of continued just growth and improvement in some of the areas we've already talked about. Their ways of thinking become much more sophisticated. We'll focus in particular on the concept of attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, because that's commonly diagnosed sort of early in this middle to late childhood period. So we'll talk a little bit about ADHD, what causes it, what the symptoms are, etc. So first, in regards to physical growth. So as I said, we start to see some really pronounced gender differences emerge during this age 7 to 12. Girls tend to be shorter and lighter up until about age 9. And then girls typically will have their growth spurt earlier, about 2 years earlier than boys typically do. So around 9, girls will start to sprout a lot more, they'll become taller. And so for most of this age range we're talking about, from like 9 to 12, girls are actually going to be taller than boys. Let's see, for all genders, the lower portion of the body tends to grow more during this period. So you get really long, lengthy legs, whereas the top part of the body isn't growing quite as much in proportion. You have bones lengthening, broadening. Muscles become, more pronounced, but they're still very flexible. Another really important thing that starts to happen during this stage is the growth of permanent teeth. So up until this age, you would have had your baby teeth that you're slowly losing. Definitely by the end of this, all of the permanent teeth will have appeared. Dental hygiene, incredibly important throughout all of these stages, but particularly as we start to see those permanent teeth emerge, then things like braces and stuff become much more common. Children during this age are really likely to outgrow their clothes very quickly. So that can be kind of a struggle as a parent. You're constantly having to buy new things, or maybe try to buy clothes that are a little bit too big so that they grow into it. So it's very common, especially when they have those growth spurts, to have to replace things like clothes and shoes, etc. Another thing in regards to growth, this is also the age where we see a lot of like growth pain, particularly in like the joints, like the knees and the elbows. There might be pain and soreness whenever those bones are growing. So that's a common issue during this time as well. There are also certain health problems that start to crop up more during this particular period. So some of this is due to nutritional issues, things like malnutrition, or kind of the opposite end of that spectrum would be issues with obesity. Malnutrition can affect, obviously, physical health, but also has impacts on cognitive health as well. So malnutrition might decrease someone's, focus, their cognitive abilities. It may even have long-lasting impacts on their IQ, their intelligence overall into adulthood, if that malnutrition is like sustained and chronic during this time period in particular. So malnutrition can be a pretty huge issue. Obesity, though, especially in the US, is probably a bigger concern during this age. So obesity is classified basically by the BMI, body mass index, is the most common way to measure it, like basically what's your height compared to your weight. People, children who develop obesity during this time are more likely to carry that with them and also be obese as adults. About 32% of US children are overweight and about 17% are obese. And those numbers might even be outdated. It's probably even higher than that at this point. We don't see this problem quite as much in other countries unless they adopt a more like Western style of diet. So for example, in China, obesity was almost non-existent up until very recently. In the past maybe decade or so, there's been a lot of movement in China to like try to adopt, again, like Western diets. So, incorporating more like red meat and pork and fast food and processed foods and things like that. And so once that happened, obesity in China kind of skyrocketed. It went up to about 8% from zero, basically. So we know that, a lot of those cases of obesity have to do with the particular diet that we have in this country. What else? Is there anything else I want to say about obesity right now? I would say part of the problem with obesity is, it's often driven by the parents and the choices the parents are making in a lot of cases. There is a genetic factor, so there are genes that make someone more predisposed to develop obesity. But then also, obviously the parent's diet is going to pretty much dictate the child's diet. So if the parent isn't eating healthy, it's going to be hard for the child to do so. A lot of parents also, according to studies, seem to be kind of in denial about their children who are overweight or obese. So there was a study they did where they found that 70% of parents of overweight children tended to judge their child as being a normal weight, even though they were overweight or obese. So it's very common for parents to basically just not see, kind of be blind to the issue. So in general, one of the best ways to help children who are obese is to educate the family, educate the parents, help them all kind of get back on a better diet, more active, etc. You guys probably already know this, but obesity can lead to all kinds of health issues, things like cardiovascular illness, diabetes, respiratory problems, etc. So obviously a huge problem. Yeah, in some cases, yeah, if it's extreme and long-lasting. Okay, so in addition to nutrition issues, around this age, we also start to diagnose commonly things with vision and hearing. So you all might remember, at least I did in elementary school, I had like a vision test and a hearing test, I don't know, maybe every year or something like that. So the most common issue with vision is myopia, which is short-sightedness. So that's where you cannot see things, or things that are far away or blurry compared to things that are up close. Usually myopia, there's a lot of factors that contribute to it. There's genetic factors. One of the experiential things that contributes to it, though, is having things like up close to your face early in childhood. So children who spend a lot of time, on screens is kind of the most common thing that parents think of. Like you shouldn't be watching TV up close or have your iPad or your phone or whatever. But even things like reading, right? If you spend a lot of time as a kid reading a book and it's right up in front of your face, then that can also cause myopia or short-sightedness. So that's the most common vision problem. And then hearing, really the thing that's most commonly going to affect hearing, unless someone has like a mutation where they're deaf or something like that, things like ear infections become very common during this period, again, 7 to 12. So ear infections can obviously impact hearing, especially if they're left untreated for a long period of time. And then we also see the emergence of certain chronic illnesses, things like asthma and allergies, again, also tend to be diagnosed during this kind of middle childhood period. And then the final kind of health problem that becomes very common is also injuries. So, things that happen accidentally. The most common causes of injuries are motor vehicle accidents and bike accidents. So there's been a lot of movement in the US over the past 30 years or so to encourage things like wearing helmets, seat belts, etc., to try to reduce those types of injuries. Car accidents and bike accidents. Yeah.
My kids broke their arms like at the same age, just playing.
Yeah, that's pretty common too. I've had, like, my son had a black eye at some point, just like playing baseball, got hit in the face. Yeah.
I thought they were more durable.
No. They're pretty durable. I think they're clumsy and still developing and often making choices without thinking through the consequences. So, okay. So now we're moving on to more cognitive-based developments. So starting with Piaget and his stages. So now we're in concrete operational stage of development. So some of the strengths we see here, some of these kind of carry over from our last stage that we talked about previously. So last time we talked about like that idea of conservation, like if you pour liquid from one container to another that's shaped differently, then smaller children have a hard time understanding that that's, keeping the same properties. By the time we get to this period, 7 to 12, they've fully mastered that. So conservation they can do easily. Classification, we also talked about last time, like that idea of having hierarchies of things. They also have mastered by this stage. There's also, like mathematical things like seriation, understanding kind of the order of different objects. Spatial reasoning as well, so like their ability to read and understand maps and to follow directions and routes becomes more pronounced. I don't know if we've talked much about spatial reasoning, so just to kind of go through it very quickly, in like preschool, most preschoolers can understand like single room maps. Like if you had a map of a classroom, they could kind of figure out where things are based off of that. But anything larger or more abstract, they tend to not do very well at. As we get into early childhood, they start to understand better like maps of large scale spaces and landmarks and things. And then by the time we get here to middle to late childhood, they have kind of a full understanding of maps. They can understand especially things like scale. They can understand like non-literal symbols. So, in maps, you often have like the key that, designates symbols for different things. And then just following, like I said, following spatial directions, they become much better at. Another strength they develop during this time is called decentration, which is where they can basically focus on lots of different variables at the same time. So children who are younger, if you give them some sort of like logic problem or word problem, they tend to really hyper-focus on just one specific thing, whereas in this later period of childhood, they can decentrate. So instead of focusing on just the one obvious variable, they can focus on lots of different things at the same time. They also start to use strategies like reversibility, which is where you try to solve a problem by starting at the end and working backwards. So they're much better at just kind of these cognitive strategies to try to understand how to work through logic problems, things like that. Let's see, some of the things they're still limited on, they tend to be poor with abstract ideas. So if you give them something that's not tangible, concrete, right in front of them, then they still might struggle to understand. And they also tend to not generalize strategies. So if they learn a strategy for one task or one problem, they might not realize that that same strategy can also apply to multiple other problems. So you have to kind of reteach them. And they often, because of that, have to learn in this sort of step-by-step process. They may need a lot of like hand-holding if they're doing something slightly more complex, like walking through steps of instructions one by one instead of giving them lots of instructions at the beginning and letting them go. Okay, moving away from Piaget and just looking at cognitive development more broadly, we continue to see gains in executive function, which again we've talked about multiple times I think at this point, but just to remind you, executive function is things like regulating your emotions, planning and setting goals, shifting and focusing and maintaining attention. All of those would be part of executive function. So we tend to just see kind of gradual improvements in that as well. We also see improvements in memory. So part of this is due to developing better strategies. So children during this age, they become better at elaborating on the things that they learn. So that would mean like, if you teach them some concept, they might relate that to something that they learned in another class, or relate that to something that's happening in their personal life, or something they saw in a movie. And so that elaboration where they're connecting it with other things helps increase the chance that they'll remember that thing later on. We also see continued increase in vocabulary, and they start to master more complex aspects of grammar. So in early childhood, we saw, vocabulary increasing, but there was a lot of those over-regulation where they don't understand that most rules in English grammar at least tend to have an exception to the rule. So by this time, they're starting to master those more complex grammatical concepts, starting to understand that rules don't necessarily apply in every single case. All right, so even though in general, most children during this age have some gains in executive function, some children during this time will be diagnosed with ADHD or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which there's kind of a lot of different framings of ADHD, but to me the one that makes the most sense is to think of it as a disorder of executive function. So again, executive function we've talked about, but just to list off, and I just said it, but just to remind you, things like emotion regulation, planning, following through on goals, and particularly controlling and maintaining attention are the main parts of executive function. So someone with ADHD will have deficits in one or more of those executive function abilities that I just listed off. The most common one, as is implied by the name, is the inability to control attention. So children with ADHD, they often will have a very difficult time sitting down to study or to do tasks that all of us tend to think of as maybe a little bit boring. If they are able to get themselves to sit down and start, they often will be distracted very easily. So if there's anything in their environment at all that could pull away their attention, then they're probably going to give in to that and pursue the distracting thing instead of the boring thing. And then whenever they're doing something that they enjoy more, they have a hard time disengaging their attention away from that. So if they really enjoy video games, for example, they might sit down intending to play 30 minutes or an hour and end up playing for 6 hours because they just can't disengage their attention from that thing that's very enjoyable. So instead of them controlling attention, it's like everything external is controlling their attention. Yeah. Into some of the attentional issues, people with ADHD also may have decreased emotional regulation. So they might be more prone to like emotional outbursts, to expressing their emotions in ways that we tend to agree is not appropriate. They also tend to lack the ability of inhibition, which inhibition is where basically like you have a thought or an impulse, something you want to do, but you stop yourself from doing that if you recognize it's not appropriate. So people with ADHD are not able to do that as well. So that can come out in a few ways. One is if you're having a conversation with them, they may be more likely to interrupt because all of us, if you're talking to someone, like a thought might pop into your head while they're talking, but most of us can inhibit that and wait until they finish their thought and then say whatever we were going to say. But someone with ADHD, they lack that ability. So as soon as the thought pops into their head, they just want to get it out immediately. So they might interrupt. Their conversations might take turns that don't seem to be really relevant to the conversation because they kind of go down rabbit holes in their head and then pursue that and again, like can't. And then another common symptom is impaired working memory, which again might relate to some of the stuff I was saying with attention earlier. So working memory is usually measured by sort of like how many items can you hold in your memory at a given time. So like if right now I were to tell you my phone number and you're supposed to try to memorize it and I rattle off 10 digits or whatever phone number is, if you could hold those 10 digits in memory easily, then you would have a working memory capacity of 10, right? The normal working memory capacity is between 5 and 9 items. That's kind of like common. People with ADHD tend to fall below that 5 items. So they have a harder time holding multiple items in their mind at once. And again, that might relate to attention because in order for you to remember something, you have to be paying attention to it in the first place. So those might be kind of hand in hand. So those are the main kind of symptoms that you typically see of people with ADHD. There's also the hyperactivity component, which that's kind of relates to that lack of inhibition. And I would say out of all the symptoms, the hyperactivity is maybe the least common one. So hyperactivity would be, like fidgeting. Someone with ADHD may not be able to sit. If they were in a long lecture like this one, they might get up in the middle of the lecture and start pacing around, or, they might need something they can fidget with. And again, that's kind of inhibition, right? Like all of you might feel like right now, like, oh, I'm getting tired of sitting. I want to get up and walk around, but you're able to inhibit that and think like, no, I need to sit in class and pay attention. Whereas someone with ADHD, they might just get up and start doing that anyways. So some of the proposed causes of ADHD, we know that there's a pretty strong correlation with some abnormalities in brain development. Most of these relating to the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So prefrontal cortex is the part right at the front, as the name suggests. And prefrontal cortex basically regulates all those executive functions that I talked about. So it's probably not surprising that people with ADHD, they tend to have decreased connections and activity in that area of the brain. In addition, there are maybe some disruptions in neurotransmitters. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. I don't think we would have talked about it in this class yet for any reason. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's mostly involved in like your reward circuitry. So anytime you do something that is pleasurable to you, you'll get a little hit of dopamine basically. And that dopamine also can help regulate sort of our behaviors. So like if I, spend a lot of time studying for an exam and then I go take a test and get an A on it, I'm gonna get a hit of dopamine. And that's gonna encourage me to repeat that same behavior in the future, right? To study for exams every time I have one so that I can get A's, so that I can feel that pleasure. People with ADHD, they tend to have kind of less activity of dopamine. So it's almost like they're not getting the reward of following through on their goals. So because that might disrupt that ability for them to set goals and follow through on it, because they're not getting the hit of dopamine from it. Whereas they're more likely to get dopamine from those kind of superficial things like playing video games or things that are enjoyable but maybe not long-term rewarding. And then norepinephrine is essentially adrenaline. So it's the neurotransmitter that basically just wakes up the brain, makes it more active. And people with ADHD particularly have less norepinephrine activity in that prefrontal cortex. So someone who does not have ADHD, that norepinephrine is firing away, keeping your prefrontal cortex awake and engaged so you can do all those executive functions. Someone with ADHD, they have less of that norepinephrine keeping the prefrontal cortex awake and running. So that is why ADHD is often treated with stimulant medications. So sometimes, I don't know if all of you know this, but a lot of people, when they hear ADHD is treated with stimulants, they're kind of like, why? That doesn't make sense. If you have someone who's hyperactive, why would you give them a stimulant? That seems like it would be bad, right? But what that stimulant is doing is specifically targeting the prefrontal cortex. So it's stimulating that part that's kind of sleepy and less active in people with ADHD to wake it up and help those executive functions. Yeah, yes. So in general, research has shown that either medication or cognitive behavioral therapy are equally as effective at treating ADHD, but the best treatment is to use them in combination. So to be taking medication and also doing cognitive behavioral therapy at the same time, that's going to get the best outcomes for people with ADHD.